The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content. Content. Contrary not content, the contents have it. Second reading of the European Union Withdrawal No. 6 Bill. Lord Wooker.
My Lords, on behalf of the elected House, I beg to move the bill be read a second time. Now, I'm not here to debate leave or remain or Brexit. The bill is about how Brexit is carried through in the sense that the UK does not leave without a deal. And that once a deal is there to be voted on, we shall leave if the House of Commons agrees via its meaningful vote. This House, of course, does not have that meaningful vote. The bill comes from the elected Commons, but this is not a normal situation. The timetable has been forced upon Parliament by the Prime Minister. Our role is not necessarily to rubber stamp the elected Commons, but given the Prime Minister's timetable of prorogation, the House has no time really to amend this bill without jettisoning the bill as a whole. It's too risky. This is not the preferred way to scrutinise. It is forced upon the House. And in this respect, I much regret that the Leader of the Lords saw fit to be part of the Privy Council forcing an early close down of Parliament. Knowing the sensitivity of being Leader of the whole House, I believe she should have declined that invitation. There are plenty of Privy Councillors around to choose for the task. And it's not the case that it has to be certain Privy Councillors, because in 2005, for the prorogation Privy Council, there were 3 Privy Councillors present at Windsor, none of them for the House of Commons, 2 ministers from the Lords, of which I was one, and another, who was neither a member of the government nor either House of Commons. So there's plenty of Privy Councillors. The Leader of the House did not have to accept that invitation, and it's dragged this House into the issue of closing down Parliament early when it wasn't necessary. But we need to consider what is sent to the Lords and the context in which it's been sent. There's a clear breakdown in trust in the Commons, and it's under extreme pressure. And it's now decided, as it did earlier in the year, to try and take some responsibility and control of the decision on a no-deal Brexit. To coin a phrase, the Commons has acted to stop a no-deal Brexit by any means necessary. And we've gone past the stage where many of the public thought no deal meant not leaving. I mean, the Yellow Hammer papers have made that clear to everyone concerned. Well, Lords, I always preface my presentations on the Peers in Schools programme by saying we've got 2 Houses of Parliament, but they're not equal. The role of the Lords is to scrutinise, sometimes ask the Commons to think again, but knowing the Commons always has the last word. But we're not in normal times. As I said earlier, the Prime Minister's timetable means we're in no real position, whatever the business arrangements for Monday, to ask the Commons to think again on this bill. It amounts almost to a national emergency in terms of legislation. And we need to treat the Commons with respect in terms of what they've put forward to try and achieve the objective. It alone has the legal and political responsibility for the meaningful vote. It is as divided as the nation, but it has sent us a bill. And we should now, insofar as prorogation timetable allows, operate the conventions to give the Commons the last word. And, my Lords, the conventions are in play as never before. We saw that yesterday. Indeed, the conventions are being changed. And a convention breached requires what we might see as an unconventional approach. Hence the business motion. Hence, effectively, timetabling the consideration of this bill. When I was young and out of order, my mother used to call me Geoffrey rather than Jeff, and often told me 2 wrongs don't make a right. Today I have to ask, If the rungs are not 2 but more, many more, 8, 9, a dozen at least, what do we do? We've got the early closing down of Parliament, misleading on negotiation, ignoring PERDA rules, spending without the OBR, attempting to leave come what may, refusing to publish the consequences of leaving for the poor, failure to table amendments to the withdrawal agreement, attacking Dublin, running the clock down, leaving UK citizens high and dry in the EU and leaving EU citizens in the UK in limbo, putting the Union in peril. That, to me, is a massive breach of the conventions that we should be operating under, which has caused this reality of this bill. This bill is a response which is unconventional to the breaching of the conventions. I commend it to the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time.
My Lords, this is actually a simple and quite straightforward bill, but that doesn't make it unimportant, because what it seeks to prevent, a no-deal crash-out on the say-so simply of the Prime Minister, does have major implications. It's not about whether we leave, but about the method of our going. Whether we depart as friends, neighbours, allies, with agreement between us, and in a way that best supports our economy, security and the people across the continent. It matters for them. But how we leave also matters for our democracy. It must not happen without the consent of the Commons. We rehearsed the economic and security risks of a no deal in your Lordship's House on Tuesday. This bill is about something else. It doesn't say we could never leave without a deal. It says that that could only happen provided the Commons agrees. We've already in your Lordship's House helped write into the Withdrawal Act that any deal on which we leave must have the consent of the Commons. So this bill simply extends that to include leaving without a deal. And to ensure that that is the case, it requires the Prime Minister to seek an extension to the Article 50 negotiating period, either to provide for that deal, that that time can be there, or to allow the Commons to concur with the no-deal exit, if that's what the Prime Minister is to recommend. So, my Lords, the bill is actually quite simple. It's democratic, and we will support it from these benches.
My Lords, I also thank the Noble Lord Rooker for introducing this bill. As has been said, a broad coalition came together to support this short bill, which is simple and has a narrow focus to prevent a crash-out Brexit for which there is no mandate. And as Hilary Benn MP said, preventing no-deal Brexit is the central, most important question facing the country. I pay tribute to the responsible senior politicians from all parties who came together in the national interests, and as we know, that included 2 distinguished former Conservative Chancellors of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond and Ken Clarke. Supporters of the bill are open about the fact that beyond preventing the devastating harm and disruption of no deal, they have very different views on how to resolve the Brexit question. And that none of those options are precluded by this bill, which has, as I said, a narrow scope. And as Alistair Burt, the co-sponsor of the bill, one of the co-sponsors, said, is the bill a stumbling block to negotiations? No, it is not. The bill does not prevent the Prime Minister or the Government from negotiating. It simply prevents no deal unless the Commons agrees to it. And it gives the Commons powers over the extension process. So it is taking back control for Parliament in action rather than in empty rhetoric.
My Lords, can I briefly raise some concerns about the impact of a no-deal Brexit on children in low-income families, and welcome this bill, as the Noble Lord Rooker said in his opening to this debate. there is a particular concern about families on low income and the adverse economic impact on them following a no-deal Brexit. In the course of austerity, we have seen families on low incomes suffering very significantly. The cuts to local authorities in terms of the support for vulnerable families have been reduced. And as a consequence, what we have seen and has been recorded in numerous reports and the numbers of children coming into local authority year on year rising. Generally, it's the children from the poorest families who are taken into the care of the state. So I do very warmly welcome this bill in that it prevents this no-deal exit. And I am very concerned if we proceed with a no-deal exit that we will see more harm to these families. I'm also concerned about the numbers of children who are not fully documented, who are of uncertain immigration status, and particularly those children in care. Local authorities are finding it difficult to get proper documentation for about 3,000 or 4,000 children in local authority care. So in his response to the debate, I'd be grateful if the Minister could address the particular issue about concerns about the welfare. Oh, he won't be responding. Well, I'd like to just... It's perhaps the noble Lord Rooker might, or the opposition might say a few words about their concerns about the impact on low-income families and also concerns about the documentation of children with uncertain immigration status, particularly those in local authority care.
My Lords, this bill will of course go through, but any ideas that it's going to solve all our problems, I think, can be dismissed here and now. We've already heard of some of the dilemmas ahead, and those dilemmas are going to be not only for my own party and for the government, but for the Labour Party as well, as the morning newspapers and the morning broadcasts make very clear. There are some very difficult questions for Labour to have to resolve, which they haven't yet done.
I thank my noble friend for giving way, and I do have enormous respect for him and what he has been trying to achieve in this House. But I have to say, if we are honest, the issue of the hard border and any of these mitigations are only trying to make a hard border slightly less hard. The only way, if we leave a customs union and single market, of solving the problem in Ireland is to have a border down the Irish Sea and cut Northern Ireland off. Is that what the Conservative and Unionist Party wishes to do?
That statement again reveals the sort of Manichaean approach, the only way. There are in fact controls at Larne already on animal and weapons, livestock, down the Irish Sea. These exist already. There are in fact controls all around the invisible border in Northern Ireland. So this constant either-or is actually misleading us and guiding us away from sensible compromise solutions which any calmer atmosphere would soon reveal. So, my Lords, I just say about this bill. Delay, frankly, is going to solve nothing, although it seems to be a way out. But another 3 months and we'll be back exactly where we were before. The referendum, so beloved of the Lib Dems, I don't think actually will sign. Even if we get it through, I don't think that will solve anything either. Election is bound to come sometime, but I just say to my noble friends that whether it comes or not, normal times are never going to return. We are living in a completely different digital age in which populism has been empowered, and both the big parties, my own party and the great Labour Party, are going to have to reunite and change on entirely different terms. Neither can build on the basis of the old dogmas. If that is the one lesson that emerges from this unhappy situation, well, at least let's take account of it.
My Lords, it's evident already in some of the terms of this conversation, this debate, that we've got to get away from this binary thinking about leave or remain. They were terms that pertained to the referendum in 2016, where the question was what. Where we've got stuck is on the how, and you don't need a degree in logic or philosophy to recognise that they are different questions. And the members of the other place of this House trying to take seriously their obligations under the Constitution to serve the people of this country means that we've got to this sort of impasse. It's not because of negligence, it's not because of waging ongoing campaigns from 3 years ago. I deeply resent the constant insinuation that if you voted Remain, then you remain a Remainer, and anything you do has to be suspected as being a plot to ensure Remain. There are many people in this House who voted Remain, who have gone on to say, but the referendum result was to leave, and now we have to move on to the question of how we're going to do that, but with a responsibility to look to the interests of our country. Now, if, as the Prime Minister said fairly recently, we will cope easily with no deal, then why not publish all the stuff that says what the actual costs of no deal will be? As, for example, King's College London, the UK and EU project have done, and others are doing. Why not listen to those from Ireland and Northern Ireland who looked somewhat askance at some of the discussions going on here about them rather than with them, if I can use that term. We're still wrestling with the question of how. You know, I have flirted in my own imagination with what the virtues of no deal would be. One of them would be that it would force us to behave like adults, where you face reality, you count the cost, and you suffer the consequences. And if we're going to cope easily, and there aren't going to be these terrible consequences, well, you know, fair enough. But that's not what we're hearing from those who are doing the detailed work. And I know we have to discount experts and intellectuals, but, you know, who else is going to do the work? So, if we're going to have an extension, there are two factors at play here, it seems to me. One is that an extension is not a vacation. The extension is for work to go on, for a deal to be sought. The Prime Minister assures us that negotiations are going on, but everything we hear from the EU is that they are not. Now, who do we believe? The second factor is that the timetable, the programme, is going to be conditioned to some extent by factors that we don't have any control over, like the EU budget programme, their timings for establishing their future without us. So we can't simply extend forever. But what is the content of the conversation that will go on during any extension? Now, I think that the last thing I want to say here, really to shine some light into this debate, is while we're focusing on Brexit, the costs, the benefits of however we leave the EU, we still, when all of that is done, and actually that will be the beginning of the process, not the end, this was supposed to be the easy bit, then what's the vision? What's the vision that this Brexit is supposed to be delivering for the people of our country? What are the big values? What's the big picture? What's the country that we want to live in? We're told that this is to be the greatest place on earth to live in. Well, flesh that out. What will it look like? What will it look like for Britain to be great rather than just to have a title or a slogan? What will that be? Now, that's the imaginative work that we need to be beginning, I think, in this House and in the other place, and in the discourse in the wider country. What sort of country do we want to be? What are the values that will shape it? What price truth, reality, and behaving like adults where we face the cost and we are willing to suffer or enjoy the consequences? That's the conversation we need to be moving on to, and I fear that we will have to do so fairly soon.
My Lords, I fear I will disappoint the noble prelate for this reason, is that I unashamedly believe that it is against the interests of the people of the United Kingdom that we should leave the European Union. Throughout my political life, I believed in two things: the union of the United Kingdom and the membership of the United Kingdom in the European Union. And I could, in the next 2 or 3 years, see both of these things struck down. And I will not be the only person, I imagine, in that position. And since I unashamedly and profoundly believe that our interest is best preserved by remaining, I shall use the time available. I can answer the noble Lord Grocot's question, taken up quite legitimately by the noble Lord Howard. I shall use the time available to argue that case as fervently as I possibly can. Now let me turn to the question of Scotland. It would be, would it not, a quite extraordinary outcome if a party describing itself as the Conservative and Unionist Party were to preside over the break-up of the United Kingdom. I don't know how often noble lords go north of the border, but it's worth doing that, even if only for a couple of days, to understand the sense of injustice which so many people in Scotland feel about the attitude and the policies of the present Prime Minister.
My Lords, as foreshadowed by its strange name, the Surrender Bill, its nickname, this bill seems fated to be pigeonholed in the public debate as a Remainer instrument, which would need to be instantly repealed in the event of a Conservative victory at what we must assume to be the forthcoming general election. Of course, it gives some short-term comfort to those who, like myself, still believe that our national interest is best served by staying in. But if this bill is passed, I suggest that it may prove to be of assistance even to dedicated leaders, should they soon find themselves with a parliamentary majority. It will save them from the consequences of the impetuous decision to set the date of 31st October in stone. And it will do so in particular by allowing desperately needed time for two things the government says it wants: a withdrawal agreement and preparatory legislation. Let us assume, generously perhaps, that the government is sincere in its stated preference for a negotiated Brexit. Its current position appears to be that an election in mid-October could be followed by a few days' frenzied negotiation on the basis of proposals not yet submitted, a deal at the European Summit in mid-October, the subsequent ratification of that deal, not only by this House but by the European Parliament, and the passage of a new and no doubt lengthy withdrawal agreement bill, all by the 31st. The bill introduces an element of realism into that equation. It will have no effect if the government does achieve its stated aim of a deal by the European Summit. Indeed, as the noble Baroness Ludford said, even a subsequent deal will deactivate its requirements, clause 1.5. If the government does not achieve its aim, the extension that must be requested under the bill is long enough for negotiations, but not for a further referendum. Indeed, clause 2 proceeds on the assumption that negotiations will progress during that period. But if our fate is to crash out with no deal, legislation will be required. And here, too, the bill gives much-needed time. The government was saying earlier this year that 6 new bills were needed before a no-deal Brexit. 5 of those bills are still before Parliament. They will obviously not progress over the next few weeks, and some of them, as I understand it, may not even be possible to carry over into a new session. Without those bills, the government will not be able, to give a few examples, to establish a trade remedies authority, set fishing quotas, or even end free movement, if that's what it wishes to do. To the dangers of a no-deal Brexit must be added the hazards of a legal vacuum. Then there are the 100 Brexit-related statutory instruments that the Brexit Secretary said on the 27th of June were required before Brexit Day. According to today's UK Constitutional Law Association blog, only 27 of those have been laid, and Parliament is about to lose its ability to sift and to scrutinise any that may be laid in the weeks to come. My Lords, we are all being urged to be ready for Brexit. This bill is, among other things, an essential part of that process, and it has my support.
My Lords, I hope, because of the deep divisions in our country, which have been visceral, we will give some thought, when the election comes, to having a referendum on the same day. Well, somebody may utter a note of dissent, but there are many of my friends, and we've not been supporters of a second referendum, who believe that this may well be a way of separating who people particularly want to govern the country and our place in Europe.
My Lords, I fear that the new Prime Minister, his advisers and his ministers are clearly hell-bent on crashing this United Kingdom out of the European Union without a deal. There's a dogmatic hard-right elite in number 10, and in passing this bill, Parliament is standing up for the decent majority in this country and against that malevolent elite. This sinister, self-serving, ideologically obsessed, willfully destructive approach has to be stopped in its tracks, and we, in your Lordship's House, have a chance to do that today in supporting the elected House of Commons. My Lords, a salutary measure of the reckless dogmatism of the Brexiteers is surveys actually show that 2/3 of Conservative Party members and the same proportion of Leave supporters simply don't care if Brexit means a hard Irish border or Scotland leaves the United Kingdom. For them, Brexit is everything. With the clock ticking rapidly towards the 31st of October, the new government has done precisely nothing in its couple of months in office. Deliberately so, my Lords. Whatever the Prime Minister's disingenuous protestations, he's running down the clock to crash out of the European Union on the 31st of October unless we stop him. Because we simply cannot believe what he says. My Lords, at the root of the problem is that the Prime Minister and his fellow Brexiteers have never had a proper plan of their own for Brexit. They never put one forward in the referendum, and on the Irish border, he still doesn't have a plan. That's why many of them openly favour no deal, because it's the only alternative if you have no plan. My Lords, the truth is that no deal equals a hard border, because that's what falling out under World Trade Organization rules means. I'm no fan of Prime Minister May's withdrawal agreement, but I do accept the backstop, knowing the complexities of Northern Ireland from my time as Secretary of State. In his reckless, bull-headed fashion, the Prime Minister has made it the villain of the peace, made the backstop the villain of the peace. But it's an insurance policy. And if alternative arrangements are found to achieve the same objectives of the same open border as we have now, then it is set aside. What's wrong with that? My Lords, the Prime Minister and many commentators here, and sadly some elements in Belfast as well, try to pretend Northern Ireland is no different to anywhere else, that it's just another border, like as he famously said, between two London boroughs, and just another straightforward place where trade in goods is the only issue. In fact, the Prime Minister seems to have dumbed this down even further and decided that the only goods traded are animals and food. There is no other border in the whole of the world like the Irish border, and that's why it needs a particular solution, not a no-deal outcome. My Lords, the Prime Minister surely knows deep down that it's not true either that this border is simply about animals and food. It's a 300-mile border with 300 crossings, and that's the formal ones. Leave aside the farms that cross the border and other communities that straddle it. Unlike almost every other border in the world, it has unique arrangements under the Good Friday Belfast Agreement for North-South cooperation, and it is an international treaty, that agreement. A little noticed document published on the 7th of December by the Department for Exiting the EU lists no less than 157 different areas of cross-border work and cooperation on the island of Ireland, north and south, and many of them have been facilitated by Ireland's and the UK's common membership of the EU. These areas are the things of everyday life. They go well beyond animals and food. and must not ever have a new border erected to block or discourage or thwart them, such as food, tourism, schools, colleges, farming, fighting crime, tackling environmental pollution, water quality and supply, waste management, bus services, train services, cancer care, GPs and prescriptions, blood transfusions, gas supply, electricity supply. My Lords, almost every one of these areas is about people's everyday cross-border lives, and almost all are linked to the European Union and Ireland's and the UK's common membership of it since 1973. We joined at the same time. To interfere with those arrangements, either through no deal, through the terms of any divorce deal, or any new trade agreements we may someday somehow strike with EU partners, would be a terrible step backwards for which the people of the island of Ireland will pay a terrible price, and so will we in Great Britain. My Lords, with other peers, I learnt one other thing the other day. With Stormont suspended and unlikely to be resurrected unless Brexit is stopped, if no deal occurred, there would be no legal powers left for the Northern Ireland Civil Service to maintain the necessary civil contingency and security arrangements in border communities and beyond. In other words, no deal means direct rule. That is the consequence for the island of Ireland of no deal, and it is a serious consequence. My Lords, I'm desperately worried for the future of Britain under no deal, but I'm absolutely livid about the impact on the island of Ireland. It will destroy the work of successive UK and Irish governments in helping courageous and visionary leaders in Northern Ireland to remove borders and instead put them back up. My Lords, if for no other reason, to maintain peace and progress in Northern Ireland and good relations with the Republic, I urge that this bill pass without any amendment.
Hear, hear.
My Lords, I want to make two brief points, one of which is directly concerned with the bill, from which we have been drifting somewhat. So I would like to start by saying, in relation to the speech by the noble Lord Hayne, he has made a very compelling case for the unification of Ireland, but that may be for another day.
I believe, my Lords, that there is growing evidence of the negative impact of Brexit on the economy and on society. On the matter of no deal, I was glad to hear from the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Leeds, who asked us to look critically at the actual impact of no deal. I took actually some comfort from the statement earlier this week by my noble friend Lord Callaghan, and I know that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster is heading up no-deal contingency planning with enormous drive, enormous professionalism. The pace of transformation, I think, is at a completely different scale and rate from what we saw under the May Premiership. And that's just in case we cannot come up with the agreement that we want.
Lady for giving way. Just on the matter of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday morning, he said there would be no shortages of fresh food, and the British Retail Consortium, with which the noble lady will be very familiar from her past work with one of our major food retailers, immediately said this was categorically untrue. So does she accept what the Chancellor of the Duchy is saying, or does she accept what the Trade Association for the business in which she used to work, does she accept that they know what they're talking about?
I thank the noble Lord. I know what I know and I know what I don't know, and I do know that he is pushing things forward with an enormous amount of energy, and no doubt after that engagement will have been straight on to the death row, whoever is responsible for these things, to talk further about the arrangements. Clearly, there are going to be problems from Brexit, whether it's deal or no deal, and of course I know that food is a particularly difficult area.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the noble Baroness, with whom I have seen eye to eye on, I think, almost all, if not the majority of issues on business questions in the past. Before I comment briefly on the bill itself, could I make two preliminary remarks? One is, as a former Northern Ireland Secretary, strongly to endorse the remarks and arguments made by my noble friend, Lord Hayne. He was not indulging in hyperbole. This is reality. This is real life politics in Northern Ireland. There is an enormous amount at stake, and we would be very, very ill-advised, any of us, if for the sake of sort of boredom of the subject, including the backstop, we were simply to sort of pass over what he has said, because there are genuine risks involved in relation to the peace in Northern Ireland. And secondly, I'd like to make a comment, if I may, about Lord Hayward's intervention. From the discussions I've had in national capitals and in Brussels, I can confirm that he is absolutely right. No proposals have been made by the British government that are negotiable and that would lead to a deal being concluded in October, November, December, or any other month. However, there are certain ideas being canvassed. They are ideas which concern the sectoral coverage of the backstop and its possible duration and the conditions surrounding both those aspects of the backstop. The reason, in my view, they haven't actually been tabled is because a judgment has already been made that they will be unacceptable to those with whom we are going to negotiate. They involve a compromise of and an undermining of the backstop, which would negate, in effect, its purpose and effect. And therefore, the chances of what is being considered in Whitehall and was taken to Brussels by David Frost, who's a very credible interlocutor and diplomat representing the British government. The possibility of either of these things being accepted in Brussels sort of are hovering on zero, which is why I don't think we can take at face value the Prime Minister's statement that he is negotiating in good faith. I don't believe he wants to negotiate a deal. I think he would like to present, as it were, a fait accompli, something that he would ideally like to see, but not to negotiate. And that's simply not going to happen. My Lords, I rise to support this bill for one reason, and that is that crashing out of the European Union on October the 31st without a deal would, to put it mildly, be highly suboptimal for our country. It would prevent us from securing the continuity of our trade, our enforceable trade rights in what is our biggest export market in the world. It would prevent us from securing the continuity, in the case of very many businesses operating in the European market, of their enforceable business contracts. There are a host, a waterfront of pacts, agreements and laws that underpin our commercial and related relationship with the European Union that has been built up over half a century, all of which we would be unable to guarantee the continuity of from the stroke of midnight on leaving the European Union without a deal. I am not saying that aircraft would fall out of the sky. That many of these agreements would simply sort of disappear, dematerialise before our eyes. I'm really not saying that. But over time, they would come to be contested. There would be people for a variety of reasons wanting to pull threads and then pull a rug from underneath a variety of these pacts and agreements. And if we were to leave without securing their continuity, we would be creating the risk of huge damage and jeopardy to our commercial relations and therefore our economy, the jobs and livelihoods of investment of hundreds of thousands of people in Britain. But it would also do something else, my lords. It would destroy what lingering goodwill exists in Europe towards us. If we were to crash out and leave in such a disorderly way, in a way that would not only inflict great damage on our own country, but all those of the member states of the European Union. Such an act, if I may just finish the sentence, such an act, in my view, would make their willingness and our ability to negotiate a future free trade agreement between ourselves and the European Union infinitely harder to achieve. And for that reason also we should avoid crashing out without a deal.
I'm listening to the enormous expertise of the noble lord and indeed considerable agreement, particularly about the crash out, and which I'm in a way rather happy this bill helps possibly postpones and possibly avoids. But is he quite, and listening also to the great expertise of noble Lord Hayne, but are they both quite sure that the enormous amount of work that has been done in volumes like this one here on alternative arrangements in the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, quite unlike any other border in the world, are things that are non-starters before they're even discussed in Brussels? Is he quite sure that all the proposals for special regions, trusted traders, new arrangements for all Ireland, animal, livestock and so on, is he quite sure that all these things can be thrown out of the window before we even start? I'm not so sure myself.
Nor am I. I'm not so sure that we should just sort of push them all to one side as if they have absolutely no potential whatsoever. That's not my view. My view is that they are not realisable in the foreseeable future, and that in the meantime we would be putting the peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process in Northern Ireland in great jeopardy in a way that would be unjustified and unforgivable. So I think there is a very interesting discussion actually to be had about the future, and it does depend on certain modalities and certain technology and related approaches which do have potential. I fully accept that, but they are not for now. They are, in my view, for the future. My Lords, there is not only the obvious economic, business and commercial argument concerning people's jobs and livelihoods that is at stake. There is, in my view, also a very strong democratic argument to which we should attach great importance in our consideration of this bill. And it is this, quite simply, that there was no mandate from the 2016 referendum for a no-deal Brexit. I know people will say, well, it wasn't explicitly ruled out. Well, actually, to all intents and purposes, it was ruled out by the fact that nobody referred to it, nobody explained it, nobody justified it, nobody set out the arguments for it. Not one of the advocates of the Leave campaign ever entertained the idea that this would be the outcome of our leaving the European Union. I mean, such a possibility was sort of almost literally airbrushed out of the picture by the promises that were made by the advocates of the Leave campaign that getting a deal would be, and I quote, the easiest in history. Plus the later guarantee actually, and that was the word used, I remember, by Number 10 in repeating what the then Brexit Secretary David Davis had said. Precise words used were that we would have, and I quote, the exact same trade benefits after we leave the European Union. Now, not only have these promises of the easiest trade deal in history turned out to be wrong and actually unfulfillable. But the exact same trade benefits will, as we know, be nothing of the kind. There can't be anything of the kind. We will only sustain frictionless trade, which are the exact same trade benefits we have at the moment, if, at the very least, we stay in a customs union with the European Union and actually fully in the single market as well. That's the only way in which those promises that were made, that guarantee that was put forward by Number 10, could possibly be redeemed. And yet it is firmly, consistently and explicitly excluded by the government. The fact that this has been any possibility of maintaining frictionless trade has been explicitly excluded by the government is extremely serious for our manufacturing sector in this country and the long-term health of our economy. I do not see, I cannot understand how, given the nature of just-in-time, sophisticated manufacturing supply chains and the way in which they operate between the UK and the continent, it will be possible for Japanese car companies or Airbus or any significant manufacturing enterprise to sustain production in Britain in the medium term. That doesn't mean to say, my lords, that they're all going to sort of, pull stumps and sort of, shut their doors and pull the shutters down and leave the day after tomorrow. Of course they're not, and any sense that they might is a sort of absurd piece of sort of hyperbole. But over time, by which I mean sort of between 5 and 10 years and probably on the shorter end of that spectrum rather than the longer, these great manufacturing companies are going to have to make new arrangements. They are going to have to move production in a way that enables them to secure the continuity of their supply chains and that frictionless trade, which they will no longer have when in sustaining their production in this country. Now, let's not go back over all the customs union and single market argument. I don't know what's happened to the Kinnock amendment and his colleagues' advocacy of Norway. But all I would say is that it would appear that there is no political possibility of those sort of options being reintroduced or attracting or sustaining a majority, certainly in the other house. And they would, and let's acknowledge this, they would in any case raise issues of regulatory dependence by this country on the European Union whilst having no say in the making of those regulations. Now, I do not dismiss that. I take that rather seriously, having been on both sides of this. As a UK business secretary and a member of the European Commission, I take rather seriously the idea that we in this country would simply be on the receiving end of laws and regulations made in Brussels over which we would have been able to express no view. There are real issues involved here, and I acknowledge them. But here's the central point, if I may, in conclusion. The point is, and the Right Reverend Prelate, Bishop of Leeds, made this point earlier. The central point is that the referendum in 2016 was an in-out referendum. It was an in-principle referendum. It was not about the how and the terms on which we would leave the European Union. There were no hint of those terms spelled out between a soft and a hard Brexit, and of course gave absolutely no indication of leaving without a deal at all. So now, as we find ourselves at the behest of the new Prime Minister hurtling towards a no-deal exit, I believe that the government should accept that this really cannot and should not happen without the express approval either of Parliament or the public. Yes, I'll wind up if I may. Nice to see the government front bench intervening in a debate at long last. But here is the further point, if I may, in conclusion. I don't believe that the express approval of the British public for how we leave the European Union can possibly be expressed by means of a general election. The point I want to make in conclusion is this. I don't think that you can arrive at a clear choice about how we leave the European Union by means of a general election in which so many issues and so many subjects and so many personalities are at play, and that therefore it is a clear choice referendum that we have to look to, where the options are properly explained, a full debate is had, and the public can give their final say one way or the other about how, and indeed if the how that is on offer is so unsatisfactory, if we eventually leave the European Union. It may be that the government wants one of these options to be a no deal, and if so, it's up to the government to put forward an option of a no deal in a clear final say referendum. If they want to do it, so be it. If they've exhausted all the alternative negotiating possibilities, let that be put fairly and squarely to the public in a referendum. But it must be a clear alternative and a clear choice, in my view, that the public are asked to make, without which, I'm afraid, my lords, I don't think we are ever going to find a way of resolving what is a most acute conundrum for us.
3 points I just wanted to make very briefly, and they've been touched on in particular by the Right Honourable Noble Lord Mandelson. First of all, the question of trade negotiations. Now, we've been told again and again that the reason why this bill is so suspect is because it cuts the Prime Minister off at the knees when it comes to the negotiations over our future relationship with the European Union. But as my noble friend Lord Hayward has pointed out, the question is, what negotiations? There isn't any rustling in the shrubbery. You ask the President of the Council, you ask the President of the Commission, you ask the President of the French Republic, you ask the Chancellor of Germany about the proposals, and the Taoiseach, about the proposals which justify our Prime Minister in his observation that things are going well, the government is putting forward all sorts of bright ideas. No reply. It'd be nice to hear from the front bench later on this evening. What is the state of play with these negotiations? What are we actually proposing? Presumably somebody knows. Or maybe it's the case that the eminence grise in the regime. Maybe one should call him the eminence, Mr. Cummings, who's brought a new approach to personnel management to number 10. Maybe we should just take it from Mr. Cummings that all this is a sham. And if it's a sham, all the more reason for having this legislation in place. And if it's not a sham, if we're making terrific progress, it seems to me very likely that we need rather more time to complete the progress. Hence, one of the advantages, and it's a reply to a question which was posed earlier, hence the advantage of a few more months being built in, if absolutely necessary. Second point, which is related to that, is touched on by the good chaps theory. Because, of course, what that needs in order to be operable is a sense that the people you're dealing with are good chaps. And one of the reasons we know, which underpins some of the discussions about when there should be a next election, one of the things we know is that there is a strong sense, I put the point no more firmly than this, but I use a phrase, use a word used by my right honourable friend Kenneth Clark. There is a certain suspicion of the disingenuousness of the Prime Minister. And maybe there are those around the place who aren't absolutely sure that he and the people who surround him are good chaps. We know that 8 of them voted again and again as bad chaps against the proposals that the last Prime Minister brought forward. And one of the reasons why we have had this long period of delay is because of the activities, the high productivity rates of the ERG during the negotiations so far. There's another aspect of the good chaps thesis of Peter Hennessy, the noble Lord Hennessy, which I think needs to touch on. I thought that my right honourable and noble friend, and my friend Lord Howard, was rather curious in the division he drew between the executive and the legislature when it came to international affairs and international negotiations. Now, I, like him, was a Secretary of State for the Environment. I used to go to international negotiations on the environment with the reports of select committees, with legislation from the House of Commons determining what I should try to do about ozone-depleting substances, or water quality, or air quality. When I was a development minister, I had to operate within the terms that the House of Commons has agreed on the proportion of our GDP which should be spent on overseas development. I also had to comply with what the OECD said about that as well. When I was a colonial despot, I had to implement what the House of Commons, what Parliament had decided about the joint declaration and the terms within which Britain should exercise its stewardship in our last colonial dependency. So don't tell me that there is an absolute division between what executives can do abroad and what the legislature has a right to determine. And the last point I want to make is about Northern Ireland. I'm not going to repeat the points very well made by the Right Honourable and Noble Lord Hayne or the Right Honourable and Noble Lord Mandelson. And I'm not going to repeat what I've said on other occasions in this House about the Northern Ireland border. I think it's a sign of the beginning of dementia when you start quoting your own speeches. But in the very first speech, no, second speech I made on the withdrawal bill, I talked about the border and talked about the fact that one of the only 2 interventions, I think, made by the last Prime Minister during the referendum campaign was about the appalling difficulties, if we left the European Union, of managing the border. And that was true. And there have been 2 points which have been made regularly about the border. The first is the terrible difficulties as soon as you've left the single market or the customs union in dealing with that border. Because the answer to the question which some of us posed to my right honourable and noble friend and very intellectually sprightly Lord Howard, the answer to the question about where else in the world can you find 2 customs unions, 2 countries in different tax regimes side by side which don't have a border, the answer to the question is there aren't any. There are ways in which you can find ways of making it easier to deal with a border. But there's no way where you have different customs unions, different other arrangements, tax arrangements side by side where you don't have a border. And the problem about that in Northern Ireland is very simple. That under the other WTO and for other reasons as well, if the Republic of Ireland is in a separate customs union to Great Britain, then there has to be a border. It's WTO rules. There is a border. Traffic is stopped at the border. Now, there's a point which I think is even more resonant than the economic argument, and that is the question of security. And I'm sorry to personalise this, but a lot of our experience a lot of our knowledge, a lot of our prejudices perhaps in politics come from our own personal experiences. The first time I saw dead bodies, apart from those of my parents, was near the Newry Customs Post in Northern Ireland, with part of a leg on top of a rhododendron bush. We know perfectly well that there is a danger, if we don't get this right, of people being killed. Not just businesses being destroyed, not just communities being devastated, but people dying. And if you don't believe that, if people don't believe that, they should read what's said again and again by the police services of Northern Ireland and by the Garda Síochána. These are terribly important issues. And I just hope that we'll bear in mind these facts, as well as the questions of economics and trade, when we're determining the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic, the relationship between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, which many people still seem to treat as though we had vice-regal authority over it. These are great friends of ours, and we should treat them rather better than we do.
This is a national humiliation, and to allow the Prime Minister to take us out of the European Union on the 31st of October without a deal would be a travesty of democracy, because democracy didn't stop on the 23rd of June 2016. We've had a general election since then. My Lords, we need another general election. Everyone can agree on that, but what we can't agree is that a general election should be called before there is some guarantee that we will have an ongoing relationship with the European Union with some sort of withdrawal arrangement. That is what the proposed bill is offering. The proposed bill does not say that the Prime Minister has to have a withdrawal agreement. It allows for the House of Commons, by a motion, to say we will leave without a deal. But what it doesn't allow is for the Prime Minister to think he is now some sort of unelected dictator. We still live in a democracy. The government doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons, and if the House of Commons wishes to vote against the government and say we need to have a deal, so be it. My Lords, if and when we get an agreement on ensuring that the United Kingdom does not crash out of the European Union, then perhaps is the time for the general election. And my Lords, perhaps the ministers and also the noble Lord Rooker, when he responds, might consider the proposal of the noble Lord Cormac. If we need to allow the people to have a say on how we leave the European Union, as the noble Lord Mandelson said, a general election is not the way to do it. How about a simultaneous referendum, which means the general election can do what a general election is meant to do and help us form a government? A referendum can allow the people to have the final say. My Lords, I am no fan of referendums, but ultimately, what the people decided, only the people can ratify.
Yeah. To look rather to the future, I'd like to just address one of the absolutely central planks of the government's belief that they need to be able to leave without a deal as a negotiating tool. That is something that the Prime Minister has said again and again. Most recently, he spoke about this bill we are discussing as cutting him off at the knees. The trouble about this thesis is it is not supported by any evidence. There is not a scintilla of evidence that the Prime Minister or his predecessor made any progress at all by threatening to leave without a deal. After all, the previous Prime Minister coined that dreadful phrase, "No deal is better than a bad deal," at Lancaster House over 2.5 years ago. And if the European Union 27 really are quaking in their shoes about such an event, then you might have seen a bit of quaking by now. But you haven't seen such quaking. So I really do think that the whole of this approach to using the no deal as a lever is completely unfounded. It is false. It does not work. And frankly, I think the sooner we stop kidding ourselves on the government side, at least, that this is the open sesame in Brussels. It's not the open sesame in Brussels. Now, the other point was raised by the noble Lord Cormac and one or two others, which was the fact that we still do not have a clear picture of the costs and implications of leaving without a deal. This House made a perfectly imaginative proposal to the other place in July, which was ignored and treated with contumely, which would have meant that by the end of September we would have had a joint parliamentary inquiry, which could have taken evidence not from people who are party pre, as many of the speakers in this House are, and I admit I am one of them, but by organisations like the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the budgetary responsibility people and the CBI and the TUC and others, and out of that we could have had, by the end of September, a really clear picture of what was entailed. Do we have a clear picture? No. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was on the radio this morning, was asked how much it would cost, didn't know. So this is why it is absolutely essential that this piece of legislation means that when decisions have to be taken in late October, we do actually have some control over it. The third point I would make is one that has been alluded to by many other speakers, the union, our British union. I'm the son of a Scottish father. I was brought up for quite a bit of time in Scotland. I am a unionist through and through. And anyone who tells me that crashing out without a deal is not going to damage the stability and the continuity of that union in both Scotland, in Wales, and above all in Northern Ireland, frankly, they lack all credibility when they say that. So this bill, I think, is necessary. It was made the more necessary by the decision to prorogue. I don't want to go on at great length about that. Of course, the government has the right to recommend prorogation to Her Majesty, but the way this was done, the underhand way it was done, and the perfectly obvious intention to deprive Parliament of quite a few sitting days in which it could have considered these matters, that, in my view, has triggered and emphasised the need for this piece of legislation.
I have never spoken on Brexit before, and I hope to provide at least a fresh voice and maybe a few fresh thoughts. This debate, my Lords, sounds rather like almost every Brexit debate of the last 3 years, and is a slightly despondent dance upon the head of a pin to some rather miserable mood music. I want to speak, my Lords, for my contemporaries, for parents with young children, for young workers just establishing a career, for entrepreneurs establishing their businesses, and for those just getting by. My Lords, increasingly what I hear is they just don't care and they don't identify as Remainers or Leavers. They just want us to get on with it. Let us do that, my Lords, and give ourselves and our children a certain future. As the noble Lord the Prelate said, the question now must not be whether we leave, but how we leave. My Lords, I have a suggestion. While this bill purports to take no deal off the table, perhaps in the spirit of new compromise, we could consider equally taking Remain off the table. We could focus all of our considerable skill, erudition and efforts on leaving well, and on healing all these bickerous divisions. My Lords, I think we owe it to our children. It was my kids' first day in school yesterday, and I spent the day in a much more childish play than I think they did. My Lords, I was once a Remainer. Indeed, as a Burgundian family that set up shop in Devon over 800 years ago, we've done rather well out of a previous European Union. But now I am firmly a post-Brexiteer. My Lords, we've got to look to the future. And my Lords, we've left Europe before many times. and we've rejoined Europe before. My lords, remember Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, the field of the cloth of gold, the Reformation, remember the glorious Revolution. My lords, having family members proudly active in all those engagements, I hope my presence here can remind your lordships that a negotiated departure from the current European Union does not preclude us from an active and leading role in our continent, or indeed, perhaps, from rejoining it at some point in the future, whether sooner or later. My lords, I support this bill if it allows us to move on and finally to get on with our national life. My lords, I also support the brave efforts to prevent the current government from herding us like lemmings off the no-deal cliff with the parade of yellowhammer horribles that would follow us. My lord, for farmers, fishermen, for families, for Ireland and for the whole of our future of our United Kingdom, I really support this bill.
I worked, as some of you know, for 15 years in the European Parliament with the Noble Lord Callanan, the Noble Lord Balfe and the Noble Baroness Ludford and other noble lords. I have to say, and I'm not making any political points, that this is exactly how I feel, but the European Union that I see represented by some in this House is not the European Union that I have experienced and that I know well. The European Union of representatives of their countries who come together in order to reach a compromise to serve the greater good and the greater number of people. Governments coming together in the Council of Ministers to work together, to vote together. And if there is a big issue, it's that those governments who, when they vote in the Council of Ministers, very rarely reveal to their national parliaments how they voted. And the pooling of sovereignty voluntarily to achieve far greater than they would achieve by acting alone. This is the European Union that I know.
I want to just address two themes. One is a constitutional theme and one is a negotiating theme. One is about our domestic affairs and one is about our relationship with the 27. And both arise directly from the terms of the bill that we are debating. Lord Patten, quoting my hero, Kenneth Clarke, yesterday in the House of Commons, referred to an element of disingenuousness in the Prime Ministerial position. I found it very shocking that the documents revealed in the court case in Edinburgh show that the prorogation plan and timing was decided in the middle of August, and for another 2 weeks the number 10 spokesman denied that there was or could be any such plan. I find it very shocking that the Prime Minister, when the plan became clear, when the proclamation issued, the Prime Minister maintained that his motives had nothing to do with Brexit. Nobody in the country believed that, but to me it was still shocking to see in these documents, in the case in Edinburgh, that it was precisely about Brexit, that it was knowingly and deliberately about Brexit. Ken Clarke, disingenuous. We have here an issue of trust. The number 10 spokesman said this morning that if the bill that we are debating now became an act, the government, the Prime Minister, would not abide by it. I would assume he misspoke, but we recall Mr. Gove last Sunday discussing with Andrew Marr and refusing to say that the government would implement the law of the land. they would wait and see what it said. We saw on the same day that among the clever plans that Mr. Cummings was cooking up was simply not sending the bill for royal assent. This is not exactly the good chap's theory of government. I find it difficult to deal with this issue of trust. I spent a long time in the public service, and one did not see one's political masters being disingenuous, telling lies. One saw them avoiding answering difficult questions. One found ways of helping them avoid answering difficult questions. One gave them answers to other questions which might be suitable. But one never drafted a lie. I don't think that in 36 years in the public service I ever told a lie. It's a very stupid thing to do, telling a lie, because it creates a subsequent problem of trust. People don't know. So we are legislating against a very peculiar background. I was very interested by the noble Lord Howard's discussion of legitimacy. This was an opposition bill. This was I find that discussion more interesting than the historical disquisition, where I didn't entirely share his views. I didn't share his views at all on the discussion of legitimacy. A bill is a bill. If a bill has been passed by the House of Commons and comes to us here, it's legitimate. It is the voice of the House of Commons. If we approve that bill, that then is Parliament. The two houses of Parliament. It doesn't matter who drafted the original. It's legitimate. And it would be wholly illegitimate for the government to decide to do what Mr. Cummings hinted it would do, which is just sit on it, not send it to the palace, or what the spokesman this morning said it would do, which was ignore it. Now, I think that is a major constitutional issue. And when the government reply to this debate, I would hope that they would confirm that if this bill is tomorrow passed by this House, it will be sent forward for royal assent, and once it has received royal assent, it will be acted on. These are ridiculous questions to have to ask in our parliamentary democracy, but such is the issue of trust that I feel one has to ask them. It will be sent forward for royal assent. It will then be acted on. And nobody asked that question yesterday because it's an absurd question. I only ask it because the number 10 spokesman said today that it would not be acted on. The Prime Minister would not abide by it.
The reason I used that form of wording, and one of the original proposals was that we would guarantee that it would receive royal assent, but obviously we cannot speak on behalf of the palace, so we merely said that we would enable it to be sent for royal assent. I think the original guarantee that we were asked for was that it would receive royal assent by Monday evening. We could not give that guarantee because obviously it depends on the availability of Her Majesty. So we would send it for royal assent if it becomes an act.
Can I just ask? But of course, it would be open to the Her Majesty's ministers to advise her to give royal assent, and that's what would happen, I assume. Can that be confirmed?
Could I repeat to the noble lord the question that Mr. Marr put to Mr. Gove? Will the government act on the law of the land if this bill becomes an act receiving royal assent?
Yes. The government will abide by the law.
Yes. Can I just remind the noble lord that the last monarch to refuse royal assent was Queen Anne over 300 years ago. Subsequently, every act passed by Parliament has been submitted and has received royal assent.
I wanted to move on to the European theme and negotiation. The scripts that were spoken to yesterday by a number of noble lords contained the familiar argument that the Prime Minister has been using extensively, that the legs would be knocked out from under his negotiating strategy if no deal was taken off the table. Now, I've spoken on this before, and I don't want to bore the House. I believe that is completely untrue. I believe that to say that if you don't give me what I'm asking for in a negotiation, I will shoot myself, that is not a credible threat. We know that the pain is asymmetric. We know that although everybody is damaged by a no-deal, crash-out Brexit, it is the United Kingdom which is damaged hugely more than anyone else. We know that, and they know that. We know that there is a problem of asymmetric preparation. They are better prepared than we are, even although they have proportionately less of a problem than we have. Third point, this is a new point. Everything I've said up to now I've bored the House with before. Here comes a new point. It is now not possible, or it will very shortly be not possible, to get a new deal agreed at the European Council on the 17th of October. I think that the Prime Minister may listen too much to Mr. Cummings, who is an expert on game theory, has studied game theory very closely. I don't think he's done much international negotiation, but he knows a lot about game theory. I believe that what he is playing is the game of chicken, which we know from American movies of the 50s and 60s, where you put your foot hard down on the accelerator, you ideally throw away the steering wheel, and you drive straight at each other, believing the other guy is going to swerve. There are two problems with applying this theory to negotiation of the European Union. One, they are a union. They are 27 member states. It takes them a very long time to make a decision to swerve.
Can I draw my noble lord's attention to my entries in the register, from which you will see that I am now in my 41st year with an appointment in Brussels, 25 as an MEP and the last 15 in other capacities. What it will not tell you is that for the 19 years previous to that, when I left school at 16, I worked in international organisations, firstly in the Crown Agents for the Colonies, then for a brief period in a junior position in the Foreign Office, and then for the cooperative movement. My whole life has been devoted to multilateralism, and it has always been a difficult proposition. From the East African Common Services Organisation in 1961, the first multilateral body I came across, to today, there have always been opportunities for misunderstandings, for clashes, for different cultures. But the important thing is that multilateralism has worked. Multilateralism has been of great benefit in many different areas of this world. I do not believe that if we left the European Union, the world would end. We would, of course, survive. Now, the Labour Party last night decided that it did not wish to support an election until this bill is passed. I hope that when it is passed, the Labour Party will support an election, because the House of Commons is now ungovernable. The government is in a minority of 20, thanks to its own foolish actions, and it cannot get anything through anymore. We have to have an election, and only an election can settle this. And I would ask the parties opposite and the SNP to come to some sort of agreement as to how this is to be resolved. My personal conclusion is that it probably has to be another referendum, because the people have spoken once, and it would be bitterly resented if the politicians took the decision without consulting them again. On the other hand, if the people return a coalition government, that has to be part of the coalition programme, and then you can get a referendum bill through. It might take a month or two, but I mentioned that I have these jobs in Brussels. It gives me an office in the European Parliament. I have a staff there, only one of whom is British, so I have a fair amount of international exposure. If the British government was to ask for an extension to have another referendum, it would be given. You wouldn't need a bill in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. The EU would be pleased to give an extension for the purpose of having a referendum. Where they are not very happy is giving an extension so that we can carry on arguing. Because, as they say, and the point has been made on several occasions, nothing is being put on the table. Because, let me just finish by saying, I said we could leave the EU, it would be difficult but not disastrous. But we also were members of the Council of Europe, where the British government has played a uniquely destructive role in opposing its budget, where the Court of Human Rights has had to be cut back because the British and Mr Salvini from Italy, now mercifully consigned to history, were obstructing even an increase in line with inflation. So we've got to deal with the multilateral bodies better. We should be saying more about the WTO, where the United States is threatening to bring the whole appeals procedure to a halt by refusing to appoint judges. We could never have a referendum on NATO because it's too central to Britain's interests to have it tossed around in the political field. I feel that the referendum that we had on the EU was a fundamental mistake. Yes. We have now made the mistake, but it is our duty to undo it. There are some things, and we have to accept, that the political class may actually know how to do. And on occasions, democracy has to be qualified. That's an unpopular thing to say, but it happens to be absolutely right. On occasions, democracy has to be qualified, and you sometimes have to say to people, I'm terribly sorry, I hear what you say, but you're wrong.
From the academics in the UK and a Changing Europe research unit, which is about the issues, implications and the impacts of leaving the EU without a deal. And at this point I declare my interest in King's College London as set out in the register. I rise in support of this bill, and I'll confine my remarks to explaining why I believe it's so important to avoid no deal. The report I mentioned usefully reminds us that while the Prime Minister's no ifs, no buts, no maybes approach is presented as offering a clean break and allowing us all to just get on with it, it is in reality nothing of the sort. It's not, as the no deal, as the report says, is not a neat way of resolving a complex problem, but a way of rendering a complex problem infinitely more so. No one should delude themselves that no deal will in itself be the end of the story. There is no realistic possibility, and indeed no suggestion from anyone on any side of this debate, that we will not have a future relationship with a bloc of countries that represents our largest trading partner and our nearest neighbours. So no deal won't be the end of negotiations, but the beginning of a new, more complex and likely even more prolonged set of negotiations. And without them taking place under the framework of a deal, do we really think those negotiations are going to be any easier? In this scenario, any future deal will almost certainly require unanimous agreement from all member states and ratification by their own parliaments. And these negotiations will all be set against a backdrop of bruised and damaged relationships, both within the UK itself, as we are already seeing, but also between the UK and the EU. Leaving with a deal would mean a transition period during which trade would continue as now, while the two sides negotiated a future relationship, No deal means a cliff edge, with the UK treated by the Union as a third country. And the impact on trading goods would be immediate, with new regulatory and customs arrangements coming immediately into force. This would mean disruption to supply chains, impacting crucial sectors like food, medicines, and just-in-time manufacturing. Larger businesses might be able to withstand the storm. Smaller companies are unlikely to have the reserves to do so. Trade in services, always the Cinderella of the Brexit story, would be hit particularly badly. If the UK exits without a formal deal, it will no longer be covered by the services agreement of the European Economic Area, but will have its trade with the EU governed by the General Agreement on Trade in Services, a treaty under the WTO. GATS, as the acronym goes, provides far less access than the current EEA arrangements and therefore fewer opportunities for the UK services sector. And this disadvantage will be compounded by another challenge. The professional qualifications will no longer be automatically recognised in other European countries. Under the EEA, UK qualifications are subject to mutual recognition agreements. So if you're a UK qualified accountant or architect, you can provide services in other EU countries. Under no deal, this would immediately cease to be the case. So professional services suppliers would have to apply not just to have their qualifications recognised, but also for working visas. My Lords, this is a sector which is the second largest services exporter in the world, with 2018 services exports valued at £283 billion, or 45% of total UK exports. And of this, £117 billion were exported to the EU. And this is a sector, let's not forget, that provides 1 in 5 jobs up and down the UK. My Lords, there's also no clarity on what no deal will mean for freedom of movement from November the 1st, and recent government pronouncements, I'm afraid, have not made things any clearer. The Noble Lord Cashman has already referred to the concerns of the 3 million EU27 citizens currently resident here. But without a deal, what new rules will apply? And how are employers, landlords, or providers of public service supposed to apply them? And the profound sense of insecurity that EU citizens currently feel in this country is no doubt shared by those Britons resident in other European countries, for whom the position is perhaps even more complex and unclear. A further little discussed consequence of no deal is the immediate loss of access to EU databases and other forms of cooperation, including the European Arrest Warrant, the Schengen Information System and Europol. And in a world where data is key, this is going to present very real challenges to policing, to security operations, and I'm afraid it will also provide a welcome window of opportunity to criminals intent on illegal access to and use of data. And then, of course, there's the island of Ireland, almost certainly the greatest and most serious unknown at this point, and already discussed in real and compelling detail by other noble lords today. Of course, many of the worst possible consequences of no deal, severe disruption to road, air, transport links, will be averted in the short term because of temporary workarounds which the EU has put in place. But some of these expire as soon as the end of December, just 2 months into no deal. And it's interesting to speculate what will happen to those temporary workarounds at that point, when we could well be engaged in an unedifying dispute over monies due under a so-called divorce bill. My Lords, whatever happens, we will, as the Noble and Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Leeds, suggested, eventually come through. But we cannot pretend there will not be significant costs to no deal, socially, culturally and economically. Earlier research from the academic research unit I mentioned earlier found that trading with the EU on WTO terms would, after 10 years, reduce the UK's per capita income by between 3.5 and 8.7%, and they are not the only credible sources coming to a similar conclusion. And so, my Lords, I'd ask that as we consider this bill today, we are under no illusions that no deal would provide closure on this sorry period in our nation's history. It would be just the beginning of a process that will not be easy, that will be time-consuming, that will be politically fraught, and that will damage our economy. And let's not forget the inevitable reductions in public spending that will be the consequences of economic downturn will hit hardest those people who are least able to stand it, the poorest, the most vulnerable and the marginalised in our society. And for all these reasons, I rise to support this bill.
I speak today as a Conservative peer, and therefore it behoves on me to look at the position in relation to the Conservative Party. Because essentially we are discussing a bill which says we do not trust the government in its current position. That's the essence of what this bill is actually saying. And unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion, and it hurts me to say it as a member of the Conservative Party, but I'm moving to that same position in relation to the current government. Now, why have I come to that conclusion? Because I can understand all the disagreements with this particular bill that Lord Brown and Lord Bridges and others have made. But we're in a position whereby we're being told by the Prime Minister that he wants a deal. But at the same time he announces that, well, we're going to prorogue Parliament. Well, on Monday, the Prime Minister is due to be in Dublin meeting the Taoiseach. What is the point of saying to the Taoiseach, oh, I'm coming over to negotiate? By the way, as I indicated earlier in my intervention on Lord Dane, I don't have a plan. I've got nothing on the table. But I'm coming over. But at the same time, I'm going to call a general election. A general election which will take up 6 weeks of the negotiating period through to the 31st of October. Now, if I was the Taoiseach, I'd pick up the phone to number 10 and say, don't bother. Don't bother to turn up. But of course, the phone call is likely to go through to the gentleman that has been referred to on a number of occasions during this debate. And if it does, we can imagine the courtesy with which that call will be received. The same courtesy that Mr. Clark received when he made a phone call only a few days ago. And I do find it utterly unacceptable. And it's one of the reasons why we lack trust, not only in this chamber, but in the other chamber, and growingly in the nation at large. I find it unacceptable that the Chief of Staff, who advises on these matters, whether it be negotiations or whether it be on the timing of the general election, and here I do disagree with both Lords Balfe and Lord Bridges, because as far as I'm concerned, I'd say to the Labour Party, don't have the general election until after October the 31st, because I don't actually believe what is going on in terms of the negotiations. But is it really acceptable that as the Chief of Staff at number 10 Downing Street, we have somebody who was found in contempt of the Commons? I have here the report of the Committee of Privileges, which received the documentations from a select committee chaired by a Conservative Member of Parliament. The Committee of Privileges is chaired by a member of the Labour Party. And their conclusions are absolutely clear and damning. That report was then put to the Commons, some 5 days after it was received. And on the 2nd of April, Dominic Cummings was found in contempt of the House and of the committee, without a vote. In other words, it was accepted by the whole House of Commons. I do find unacceptable that somebody should be advising the Prime Minister on how you handle parliamentary procedure, who so recently was found to be in contempt of our practices and of members of Parliament. So for those reasons, I have difficulty with this bill because there are problems associated with it. But I understand what it is saying. And I would say to number 10 now, understand what is being said by the formation of this bill and change your behaviour immediately, because that trust must be restored in both houses.
It has to be said, the number one rule is you never lie. You never, ever lie. And I really worry, having heard about the August the 15th thing on the prorogation, what the implications are for, was that civil servant knowingly not telling the truth, in which the implications are fairly clear, that person should be sacked, or were they being told untruths? And that, to me, is important. It is worth remembering, when he talked about the decline of this, that he said the good chap theory fell into fragments on August the 28th at Balmoral. Right. And to my mind, there are wider implications about what's going on here. Listening to my former colleague, Lord True, who with passion used to speak when we were in number 10 together on various subjects of policy, speaking passionately about the importance of the rules under which this House operates. He was a bit more concise in the past, I would say. The main point, I think, however, is that I am not a fan of filibusters or guillotines, and I think that's also a symptom of the decline of this business of trust. And picking up what was said before about trust in prime ministers, I think that's crucial, that we actually have to trust our prime ministers, and I do worry that we are in a really dangerous world now. Moving on to, I think, the other constitutional point that's really important to remember about this bill is actually there's someone we have to thank for being in this position to even consider this question, and that is the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition. Because if it were not for the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the Prime Minister could have just stopped it all, gone and allowed us to leave with no deal and had an election after that date. When you look at what the implications of this bill will be, I've seen that the Prime Minister has said it makes it harder if we take out no deal for him to get a deal. And I actually believe the opposite is true. When I heard Davis talking about this, he said it's absolutely clear that getting rid of the backstop is not enough for me to support this bill, any deal that came to the Commons. And he gave the implication that we'd also have to do something on the money and also something on the courts, the jurisdiction, the European courts. And he implied that there were lots of other MPs who took this view. Therefore, what they're saying is, Prime Minister, go and negotiate a deal. By the way, when you come back, we're going to vote against it. So I don't really understand what we're doing here, because the incentive structure, if you are someone, an MP, in the House of Commons whose preference is no deal, then the obvious thing to do is whatever the deal the Prime Minister comes back with, you just vote against it, and if this bill doesn't exist, the default is quite clear in law, we would then leave without a deal. So the incentive is to vote against it, irrespective of what it is. What is the way forward from this? And a number of people have said, look, Parliament has had plenty of time to come up with not just what it doesn't want, but what it does want, and has failed miserably. And I think that's true. Therefore, my solution to this is a new Parliament. We therefore need a general election of some kind. The one thing I would say about the general election is please, please, could all of those manifestos be absolutely clear about what you're going to do, right? That, to me, is crucial, because if you're trying to get the people to make an informed choice and you give them fudge, then we could be back in exactly the same place as we are now.
Like Lord Cashman and Baroness Ludford and a number, we were all members of the European Parliament. I also had the honour to advise Conservative members of the European Parliament for 5 years. Many of my friends, particularly parliamentary friends in the other place, are quite keen to prevent us from remaining and reapplying bodies such as the European, the EEA, the European Economic Area and the European Free Trade Area, because of connotations to do with the customs union and the single market. Now, I would argue very strongly why this bill is needed, and I will end, if I remember, with a question, if I may, to the Minister, summing up the debate today. Now, we have a very short bill, very focused, and followed up by a letter to the President of the European Council from our current Prime Minister. It puts a deadline on it that obviously is a focus of some contention in the debate today, of the 31st of January 2020 or earlier if agreement is reached on a deal. Now, I would argue that prorogation is premature. It was my distinct understanding that we faced a 2-year parliamentary session that was longer than usual, but with the distinct purpose of fulfilling our legislative duty in both Houses of Parliament of passing those bills that were required not just to prepare us, but businesses, like referred to by Lord Wigley, who I'd like to consider a noble friend, such as hill farmers, who are particularly concerned. Now, we learnt this week that the Agriculture Bill will fall. We haven't even seen the Environment Protection Bill, the Immigration Bill, the Trade Rollover Bill is blocked in the other place. We have yet to see the second trade bill. All of these have implications for the farming community. We haven't yet seen the Fisheries Bill. Why on earth then are we concluding prematurely, in my view, this parliamentary session until we've had the chance to thrash out what the detail will be? I support this bill. I would vehemently argue why we need the 6 bills that were meant to be set out in this parliamentary session before we prorogue. I would sign up to a general election, but after the 5th of November, when we can actually hopefully agree a deal, and I believe that this bill before us today is instrumental in that regard. My question to the Minister, and I'm sorry he's not in his place today, is that I hope that the Government will abide by the terms of this bill if it is carried by both Houses, and the letter in the schedule as well. And can we have confirmation today, not just will the Government apply for an extension in the terms of this bill, but vote for such an extension in the European Council?
This bill is all about preventing no deal, something that I must remind the House that Parliament has made very clear earlier on this year that it doesn't want, and yet the Government is still adamant to keep this on the table. In June, I was appointed as Vice President of the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI. Over the past couple of weeks, the CBI has been travelling up and down the country, gauging firms' preparations. And there are 3 things that have come out of this. 1, no deal would not see an end to the Brexit impasse. Instead, we'd be starting negotiating from a worse position. Secondly, larger firms have already spent billions preparing for no deal, but they cannot be protected. They can prepare, but they cannot be protected. And the third thing, we know that smaller firms have neither the time nor the resources to plan properly. In the Daily Telegraph by Jeremy Warner, and he started this, and his article was, "No deal will just prolong the economic certainty, not end it." The UK, the low pound, is great for our exports, but the whole concept in economics of import substitution, you don't have import substitutions overnight. you've got to build up your capacity, and that takes many, many years. So the pound's weakness in helping exports is not an instant fillip to the economy or to businesses. And then the main point is we are net importers as a country. So if our currency weakens, our products get more expensive on the supermarket shelves and our consumers suffer. And just as real wages have showed signs of breaking free after the financial crisis, there's a threat that they're now going to sink down again. Could we know if this yellow hammer is going to be released to us in full? And then I want to just conclude with this, my lords. There is no running away from this. There are upcoming trading relationships with the EU. You can't run away from the fact that over 40% of our exports go to the EU and over 50% of our imports come from the EU. It is no point saying that the United States as an economy is bigger than the whole of the European Union combined. It is, but it makes up only 18% of our trade. So we need to have a reality check over here. Moving on to WTO terms will not be the panacea at all. The uncertainty will continue. And the irony is, for the EU, any negotiation, here it is, we go out with no deal. Where would the negotiations with the EU start? They would start with money, they would start with citizens' rights, and they would start with the Irish backstop. And they would refuse to engage in any other matters until these three issues are settled. And that's the reality. This deal is not a deal. We haven't even started the real deals. The deals of negotiating our trade, the deals of negotiating our security, the deals of movement of people. All the important things of our future are yet still to be negotiated. So it's essential to prevent no deal.
There's not been very much mention in the debate so far of what I would call real people, people outside this chamber. So I would like to focus very briefly on one of the major factors which underlay the outcome of the referendum. I refer, of course, to immigration. My lords, the immigration issue has not gone away, and it will not go away. There's a lot of talk about the 17 million people who voted to leave the EU, and indeed about the 16 million who voted the other way. I have to tell the House that I am speaking for 30 million people who want to see a reduction in immigration to this country. Now, it's true that the salience of that issue has declined considerably in recent months and indeed years since the referendum. I think there are three reasons for that. One is that many are assuming that Brexit will sort it. Secondly, that the migration crisis in Europe, exaggerated at the time, has somewhat faded. And lastly, in terms of salience, of course, Brexit demolishes every other issue you can imagine. My lords, I shall be brief, but the public are right to be concerned. I'll mention just 2 points, 2 examples. If immigration continues at current levels, we will be adding 1 million to our population every 3 years. That's the population of Birmingham, with all the infrastructure and so on that we need. And secondly, housing. Again, at current rates, we will have to build a new home every 6 minutes, night and day, for the new families who will be joining us. Finally, my lords, if we look ahead, there is now, and this is the serious point, a serious risk that our last case, as far as immigration is concerned, will be worse than our first. The present government are now proposing an Australian-style points-based system, without apparently realising that we've had such a system for 10 years, and without being aware of the fact, apparently, that the situation in Australia could hardly be more different. It seems that the expression is popular with focus groups, and that is the reason that it is now the basis of policy on a matter of real importance to, as I said, 30 million people. That, my lords, I find disgraceful. We need a serious attempt to tackle the issues that underlie this. It gets worse, because the government are also contemplating a very significant lowering of the level of skill and also the level of salary that will qualify people from around the world to come to this country. We've calculated that approximately 9 million jobs in the UK will become more open to international competition than they are now. Finally, my Lords, if the outcome of this whole saga is that we merely substitute non-EU workers for EU workers with no significant reduction in the numbers, I believe that confidence in our political system will suffer a very severe blow.
My Lords, this bill should be unnecessary. If we had a government who we could trust and a cabinet that actually took an interest in the real and devastating impacts that no deal will bring to people. This government has no mandate for no deal, and no deal is expressly opposed by the elected House. And yet, this government appears determined, by hook or by crook, and mainly by crook, to impose it upon this country.
The BMA have just published a document, and I should declare my interest as a past president, entitled A Health Service on the Brink, the Dangers of No-Deal Brexit, and it is littered with questions that really should have been answered during the years that we've had since the referendum. We currently have nearly 22,000 European graduate doctors in the UK. A third of them have said they're considering leaving. We need reciprocal arrangement for their qualifications. We have 10,000 medical vacancies already. If a third of those doctors go, we're going to have even more. And when people turn up with their sick child, their other family member, and have an even longer trolley wait than they have now, and then their relative has died because they couldn't get the health care they need, that's when the headlines, I think, will change dramatically. Because sadly, I do worry that some of the implications for the individuals in our society really haven't hit home, and in part because we haven't told them openly and honestly what the implications are.
I feel, listening to the debate and watching what's going on, I'm living in a world that's going mad. I just think too many things. I can't be alone in this. It's not just age, I think it's true. And we need sanity. And there is sanity in this House and within the parties. And I think we're only going to be rescued if sane people can overcome their differences, act in the national interest, and work together. And it may, this bill is an example of it. And I think maybe it's going to lead to a referendum. I cannot see how a general election is going to get us out of our difficulty, because what if it's a hung parliament again? So maybe it's a referendum. The second concern I have is with the need for a view as to what the future of this country is in the world. The world is changing around us fast. We're in the middle of a technological revolution that is greater than, I think, the Industrial Revolution. If you look at just the last 15 years, 15 years ago we did not have smartphones with apps. And now they're an indispensable part of the lives of everybody, and social media are changing the whole political context in which not just this country, other countries, is happening. And I've chaired conferences recently in Cambridge on quantum computing. I have to say I learned that I can chair meetings without understanding a word of what's said. On blockchain, which is even worse, and DNA, CRISPR-Cas9, for those who are interested. The things which are being brought to fruition in the world of research at the moment are going to alter the world more in the next 10, 15, 20 years than the last 10, 15 years, and that has been fast enough. And we, in the political world, political institutions, have to keep up with it and have to understand it. The tectonic plates of world politics are changing. America and China will dominate the scene. Europe will not be the centre of the world as we've thought of ourselves. And the need to have a position in which we can choose between America and China when each of them puts pressure on us is going to be important. We're going to lack company if we isolate ourselves from the rest of Europe by behaving badly towards them and having no deal. I'm hugely bothered by the way in which the word trust has been used. I am used to people trusting government institutions. It's been part of my career to try to uphold trust and ensure that people know where the boundaries are in a pragmatic way. And one of those boundaries, as the noble Lord, my successor, said just now, has been special advisers. There's been a lot of my time was taken up with special advisers, and I have a question for the government minister when he's replying. It's just a detailed question, but there were, I think there still are, rules governing special advisers. And one of those rules was that they are temporary civil servants and they do not have executive powers. Can the minister assure us that present special advisers are not exercising executive powers? For instance, sacking another special adviser is the exercise of an executive power. Special advisers do not have those powers. If someone purports to sack someone and they don't have the power to do it, is that sacking valid? I assume this has been looked into. The government knows what's going on, but I just raise it because it's a small example of a more general principle, which is that we need to ensure that the codes of conduct, not just gentlemen behaving well, good chaps behaving well, but actually the basic rules of government and codes of government are being observed. And I just feel at the moment, when people feel able to be careless and cavalier with conventions, we ought to be asking questions about whether basic principles are being observed and challenging when not. I think that's enough for now. I could go on at length about the principles at stake today, but so much has been said that I agree with, I won't repeat them. Thank you.
Point out that in 2015, when the referendum bill became law, there were 554 members of the House of Commons voted for it. Yeah. And we were no better. So having let Pandora out of the box, we are now confronted because for political and party reasons, we let a particular process emerge, which was different to our normal parliamentary process, and then we complain about the problems that are created by it. It has been done by our own hand. We all, on all sides of this House, live in glass houses. And that, I think, is something we need to reflect on as we move forward. So let's bend our efforts and every sinew to finding solutions. There's no point in arguing over who said what in 2016 at the referendum. Everybody's to blame, because either sins of omission or sins of commission. And we all put our hands up for the legislation. Don't forget, it was the coalition government that brought this legislation into Parliament in the first place.
We are discussing some very fundamental constitutional issues in this bill. The issue of the relationship between Parliament and the executive or the government. And it's highly relevant to that the Leave campaign promised us that Brexit would restore not just British sovereignty, but parliamentary sovereignty. The Honourable Lord Howard refers now not to the divine right of kings, but to the will of the people, in some ways an equally difficult concept to pin down and define. These are very wide-ranging issues. The future of the Union has been mentioned. I've been visiting Edinburgh much more frequently the last 3 years, and I understand that the future of the Union is at stake in this debate for Scotland and for Northern Ireland. What sort of country do we want to live in? What sort of values do we think we are about? And do we think that European values are not ones that we share them more with the American right, and that's where we would like to be instead. We cannot trust this government, so Parliament is justified in tying its hands, as the purpose of this bill is to do. Then there's the question of the role of evidence in policy making and of civil service advice and civil service impartiality. The basis of the relationship between civil service and government is that civil servants advise on the best basis of evidence which they can find, and that ministers decide. And what we've seen throughout this long argument about our membership of the European Community is ministers and politicians who disregard advice and push aside the evidence. A number of occasions on which ministers have blamed civil servants for decisions that they should have taken responsibility for. Poor ministers blame officials in the way that poor workmen blame their tools. And Michael Gove on experts, David Davis on their officials, and others have lowered the quality of political debate in this country, and that's part of what we need desperately to rebuild. And in passing, may I say, this is not only a matter of government. The Noble Lord Green of Dedington reminds us of the migration issue in this. I've read many of the Migration Watch reports over the years, good evidence, but presented to suggest that the migration problem from Britain is largely a European one rather than a global one, and that helped the Leave campaign very considerably, and I regret that mispresentation of evidence. Operation Yellowhammer is the most recent example of good evidence being presented by civil servants, so far as we understand it, and suppressed by the government because it didn't fit what the government wanted. My Lords, it's 3 years since the referendum. The main focus on negotiation has been within the Conservative Party and not between the UK government and the European Union. Theresa May, as Prime Minister, was pulled to the right by the European Research Group and imposed tight red lines. There could have been a compromise. Had the government said that we would have a soft Brexit, that we would stay within the single market and the customs union, everything would have been over and dealt with long before now. The fact that the red lines were tightened and tightened and tightened in late 2016 and early 2017 has led us to where we are today. And after 3 years, the Conservative Party is even more deeply divided, and we now see it crumbling at the edges. My Lords, the time remaining is short. The clock is ticking, the deadlines are approaching, and after 3 years of drift, without a clear government policy on what sort of exit we take, the idea that a deal could be reached on the 17th and 18th of October and implemented by the 31st of October is as absurd as some of the other things we have heard. As Lord Anderson remarked, the legislative basis for an orderly Brexit is simply not going to be there. So we will be going out without the legal framework which we need. That's not an orderly Brexit. So we need more time. We need more honesty about the choices, more respect for evidence and for what is possible and what is impossible. We need a government and an opposition that put the national interest ahead of party factionalism. And since we do not have these qualities sufficiently in our national debate at present, we need this bill.
The criticisms of the bill from the noble Lord Howard of Lympney in particular is that this distorts our normal process of the separation of powers. He has a rosier view of what the separation is, I think, than I do. But let it be clear, what this is doing is not preventing the House of Commons, which is the legislature, from giving its approval or not approval to an event, but saying that that is necessary before we could leave without a deal, or that there is an agreement which has been reached. It's also to be noted, given what has been said about hampering the Prime Minister in his negotiation, that the bill is clear that not until after the European Council meeting that is coming up on the 17th does the moment come when, if he hasn't reached a deal or hasn't obtained the consent of the House of Commons, he has to ask for an extension. So clause 1(3) doesn't trigger the need to ask for an extension until the 19th of October. So in those circumstances, that particular element of the concern is met. But I return to the point that's been made by a number of noble lords, the lack of trust in the government, which does result in a bill which is more constraining than one might hope to see. And I have to say this, as many other noble lords, what has happened in relation to prorogation is deeply, deeply concerning. It was deeply concerning when it was said that the prorogation has nothing to do with Brexit, when it was plain to all of us it had everything to do with Brexit. And we didn't need to see the documents which have been revealed in the Scottish case to know that. But now that we have seen them, we know that completely. And we know what is more, that the decision had been made in the middle of August at a time which was not revealed to the House of Commons, was not revealed to this House or to the people.
Lord Goldsmith's point. He is a distinguished lawyer. He will know, as well as I do, that this bill does not actually prevent a no-deal exit. Because in one of the great ironies of this process, it is in fact now determined under European law, under the Article 50 process. The final decision on whether or not we leave the European Union is now determined by the European Council. Let me also add to the assurance that I gave him earlier that this government will, of course, abide by the law. And let me also repeat the assurances that the Chief Whip in this House gave last evening, that we have received a commitment from the Chief Whip in the House of Commons that Commons consideration of Lord's amendment will take place on Monday, and it is the government's intention that the bill be ready to be presented for royal assent then.
Would he confirm and agree with his government colleague, the Cabinet Minister Nicky Morgan, who indicated on the BBC Radio 4's World at 1 at lunchtime that if the Prime Minister gets his way and there is a mid-October election and he wins it, he will repeal this bill or activate the clause within it to make sure that no deal occurs? Can he confirm that?
I repeat that the government will, of course, abide by the law. I certainly can't predict what might happen in a future general election, and nor can I comment on what a future government might do with the bill in response to that.
Lord Minister, the £1 billion net which he refers to, I have seen frequently contested because it appears to be gross and to not take account of the expenditure that the European Union would make in this country if we were still a member. Could he perhaps clarify that?
The bill would require the Prime Minister to immediately accept any offer made by the EU of an extension to the 31st of January 2020. If the EU offered a longer extension, or rather instructed a longer extension, whatever its date, regardless of its conditions, the PM would automatically have to accept unless the House of Commons says no within 2 calendar days. The fact that the bill mandates updates on negotiations and motions on those updates after the 31st of January 2020 and on a rolling 28-day basis with no end date clearly envisages either a lengthy extension or possibly a string of extensions. Parliament would then be left with 3 unpalatable options. Firstly, revoking Article 50 and overturning the result of the referendum. Secondly, extension after extension, and therefore failing to deliver on the will of the people over 3.5 years after the referendum took place. Or thirdly, accepting the existing withdrawal agreement that has, of course, been rejected 3 times in the other place.
Is my noble friend saying that if this bill passes into law, which Parliament, I think, believes it should, that negotiations will automatically end at that point? Is that what he's saying to the House? Is he saying that these negotiations, which are apparently continuing at the moment, which are doing very well at the moment, will suddenly be withdrawn from in a fit of pique? Is that what he's saying?
Noble Lord, I'm just thinking through the implications of what he's been saying, because I'd been hearing and reading that the Prime Ministers were saying, I am negotiating. In fact, the negotiations are going very well, which I took to mean that something was being discussed which he thought might be acceptable, not just the existing withdrawal agreement, and that he jumped at the idea when put to him by Angela Merkel of coming up with alternatives in 30 days. Is he now telling us that, in fact, if this bill passes, the Prime Minister will decline to negotiate any further? Is that what the government's position is?
It was no surprise to you whatsoever that this government cannot support this bill, and I would like to urge all noble lords across this House who are committed to leaving the EU and to respecting the referendum, to therefore vote against it.
Lords, I'm very grateful to everybody that's contributed. I'm merely the messenger in a way from the elected House, because that's what we're dealing with. A piece of fairly unique legislation from the elected Commons to try and deal with the uncertainties. I do appreciate, though, that my noble friend Lord Goldsmith or Callaghan, probably the only two that have actually spelt out, while the purpose of the bill is to stop us crashing out without a deal, the bill contains the mechanism for any Prime Minister who can pack the Commons to take us out without a deal. That's in the conditions in paragraph 1, and I've no doubt they'll be raised in committee. I've got two brief points. I have picked up from the sense of the debate that there would be a very high level of political immaturity in leaders in the other place if they buy an election before the 1st of November. It's quite clear trust has broken down. I think it would be absolutely balmy. That's my personal view. My final point, and I'm sorry about this, but it's a bit of a domestic policy issue. This bill is a private member's bill. It's a bit like the earlier one in the year in April, Cooper-Letwin. Now, at that time, because it was a private member's bill, the government front bench, who basically do the regulation of the chamber when things break down, went on strike. They removed themselves, and it caused us a degree of chaos in our administration. Now, today we've had a second reading without a speakers list. It's gone great, because everyone could see there was enough time to get in to speak. Now, we've got a day on this tomorrow, because after the events of April, as the member in charge of the bill, I complained to the Procedure Committee that if, when a private member's bill is in the House the government doesn't agree with and the front bench goes on strike, the power to regulate should be given to the chair. So the chair could say, that's wrong, this is wrong. You know, no reply from the Procedure Committee, acknowledgement, just dismissed. But we're going into committee and report tomorrow. I have no idea about any amendments being tabled. And I don't want any chaos deliberately caused by the front bench abdicating their responsibilities if it needs help with regulation. It's quite clear. Early this morning, 3 hours, there was hardly anybody on the bench. Nobody took any notice of any breaches of procedure, and there were quite a few. Only one was picked up by my noble friend. So I would hope that tomorrow the government will live to its responsibilities. It has on that bench, irrespective of whether it agrees with the policy or the legislation, the House regulates. It's that front bench got the power. And if they're not prepared to exercise it, they should give it to the chair for the day. I beg to move.
Question has been moved. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. As many of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. So the contents have it. My Lords, in accordance with the business of the House motion agreed to by the House today, the bill stands committed to a committee of the whole House.